On today's festive magical video, we're going to be going back and revisiting the McFarlane Toys Twisted Xmas. This is Mrs. Claus. Much like the Santa Claus, this figure was reviewed back in 2011. And I thought, you know what, it is the festive season after all. Let's go back and have a look at some of my favorite Christmas figures that I tend to put out. Not every year, but I try to put them out. I generally try to put them out every single year. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and get some measurements on Mrs. Claus. The figure is 7 inches in height. That's just the figure. Granted, the way the figure is plugged into place, you really can't stand her on her own because she's also leaning off to the side. So we have to also include the measurements of the candy cane pole that she has wrapped herself around. Factoring that in and factoring in the feet of the elf dangling from the top, the figure stands at a total 10 inches in height. Luckily, also, the way that these have been packed away over the years, the figures have still remained somewhat undamaged. I think the greater one was probably Santa Claus, just by having his little thumb blade break off, but I glued that back into place. Now, it's not to say that Mrs. Claus as a whole has remained unscathed by damage. She's remained fine. Unfortunately, the only damage that I have suffered for this entire, setup here is this little tiny elf. He looks fine, yes. But, I'll just take him out of the package here, which says, by the way, do not open until Xmas. Some elf has already taken the liberty of opening this up. Shame, shame, shame on you. That makes you very, very naughty. There's a little hole, by the way, on the... Hello. Hi there. Hi, Mrs. Claus. There's a hole that goes through it, and it pegs very loosely to the peg I'll show you in a second. Here's the elf peering up at Mrs. C. I did, unfortunately, have to glue it. What had happened was he had fallen, and he couldn't get up. And more importantly, the hat, the makeshift top package hat, broke off in the process. So you might maybe see a little discoloration there. I had to just glue it in place. I used some quick drying cement. It's a little on the visible side, but it doesn't bother me all that much. The rest of everything else is still intact, so I think I'm okay. By the way, on the designs of the elves, there's nothing merry about these elves. In fact, they have a very creepy, nightmarish, almost gnome look to them, with elongated ears, elongated nose. When I was younger, I had a book, a very scary book, which I would think nowadays would not just, I don't think you could release that, but it was called the Thingamajigs. Anybody who grew up in the 80s that had the book, the Thingamajigs, let me know down below. Very, very scary, hairy-looking creatures. That's kind of what these little elves remind me of. He's peering up at Mrs. Claus, you pervert. His colorings are that traditional colorings, so you've got the and you've got a hole in his butt as well. But he has his hands, of course, his bare arms, but the rest of the colors are traditional greens and reds. And again, really great face sculpt. Not quite reminding me of an elf, but nonetheless. So essentially, how this comes together is it's supposed to fit over like this. See, the little package goes over to the hole like this, but it sits very, very loose. It's actually because of the elf that it's supposed to sit a little easier. And I generally don't have the most luck to peg that into place. So a lot of times the elf just kind of sits very loose, sits inside the package, very on the loose side. If you can kind of line him up, it's a little bit better than most times. But there he is, peering up at Mrs. Claus. Let's have a look at her now. I think what I might end up doing is just taking him off altogether, because he's just, I know he's going to fall off. So here you have Mrs. Claus. Her base is of course, that kind of snowy texture, again, incorporating some blues in there as well. You've got the unwrapped ribbons from the sides of the package as the package has been opened up. Again, lots of the blues, the whites. I guess they couldn't have just simply gone white. It would have been a little more disappointing. And then you've got the little North Pole sign. Now, as for Mrs. Claus, though, Mrs. Claus, as you can see here, is wrapped around a candy cane pole. Wonderful. She does have a peg right on the side here, right there, that pegs into, hopefully the camera can focus, and I spin this around, there's actually a hole just underneath her foot. And it pegs just into that peg, just like that. And then it keeps the figure kind of stable and not falling all over the place. Maybe before we look at Mrs. Claus, we'll look at also the little dangling elf that's hanging down from the top of the candy cane, gawking at Mrs. C. Geez, Santa, where are you hiring these guys from? It looks as if, and I don't know if I'm reading this correctly, but all the blood has rushed to his head, giving him a much more darker, rosier complexion. At least that's the story I'm telling myself. Colors, again, you've got the more traditional greens. Here you've got more of a brown hat rather than the red or the green that we looked on the other figure. And very, very pointy elf shoes. The figure is not removable. It is attached to the candy cane. I wouldn't attempt to try to take it off. And then you got your candy cane itself. For the most part, is generally good. Because they've airbrushed some of the red stripes, they're not the cleanest, but I'm certain it's not going to be the candy cane that you're going to be checking out. Well, let's have a look at Mrs. Claus. I can certainly see why Santa only goes out one time a year. Mrs. C is actually looking rather different, one would say. She's wearing almost kind of like a red lingerie outfit with these little foo-foo little skirts and under portions of her brassiere. Face sculpt is actually one of my favorite face sculpts of the McFarlane's Twisted Lines. I think this face sculpt actually is still good to this day. There's a little bit of imperfection I've got just on the side here. I think it might have gotten scratched while it was in the Ziploc bag that I've been storing these figures in, because I don't remember that being there before. She's got some green eyeshadow and again, a little bit of a rosy lip. I like also that you can see the teeth sculpted in there as well. And she's got some holly. It looks like holly or mistletoe printed on her sleevelets that she's got. And then her hands are right here. Now her hands also, let me just flip the figure around here. The hands also peg into the sides of the pole. It's not always the easiest because I find when I peg in the one hand, it tends to want to come out from the sleeve here. So I'm always kind of doing an adjusting here and there. The feet also do tend to unpeg from that peg very frequently. But it's a beautiful looking body sculpt. I like the pose of it as well. And actually, funny enough, it's also one of my favorite thumbnails from all my videos. I didn't choose that thumbnail. It was back in the day where, YouTube gives you like 3 thumbnails. I think I just picked what one was there. And ultimately, throughout the end of it, I end up liking that one out of all of them. So it's one of my favorite thumbnails also as well. There's a closer look at all of Mrs. C's, I guess, assets. I like the sleigh bells that are running down the sides of her very shiny boots. This has an almost fur-like look to it, but it's not really. Obviously, it's not really fur. And I think it's got a really good sculpt on the hair. Posability on this figure is very, very limited. You're not going to really get much out of her other than a slight head articulation here. Technically a little bit in the hands, but that's not really going to work because you're going to be pegging those into the sides of the candy cane. And she doesn't really have much in the way of leg articulation either. I think this leg kind of hinges outward or swivels outward. But again, really, what are you going to do with it? It's intended really to be wrapped around the candy cane, and that's exactly what she's doing here. For final looks, we'll bring in Santa Claus so you can see the lovely married couple side by side. Yeah, it doesn't really seem... Maybe he's got a great personality. That's about the only thing I can figure out. And of course, he's got blades on his fingers. That's always a big help also. McFarlane seems to be a very consistent trend of, when it comes to male figures, creating these portly, over-the-top, gruesome, disfigured characters. And generally for the female figures, he always makes them a lot more sexier and attractive. That's McFarlane for you. But a very, very strange pairing in this married couple. Mrs. Claus is one of my favorite figures from the Twisted Xmas line, and before you think reasons why, it's not necessarily because she's posed the way that she is, but I think she's really got a beautiful head sculpt, and she's got a lot of things going for her. A lot of the extra elves and the candy cane and stuff like that really adds to making this much more a display piece than I really think a figure. Mrs. Claus was also released, I think, with a blonde or slightly lighter brown variant as well, which tends to get a little bit more expensive if you're going to look for her in the aftermarket. Whether you pick up that one or this regular release here, I think either case would be a great figure to add to your collection, especially if you want to be putting her on display during the month of December, of course leading up to Christmas time. Just be mindful that, of course, her husband is still waiting at home, and he's going to probably be visiting you on Christmas Eve, so just keep that in mind. Today, though, we were having a look at the McFarlane Toys Twisted Xmas. This was Mrs. Claus. Of course, many more magical videos, probably not to this level of sexiness, but many more videos are going to be coming to you guys during the rest of December. Of course, we're going to be celebrating the holiday season with many more holiday-themed reviews. Some other reviews will be coming as well, so if that's not really your thing, don't worry. We're going to have a look at other things as well. Lots more to come, guys. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you hit that little subscribe button down below. More videos, like I said, are coming your way. Just keep your eyes open. Keep your eyes open. As always, guys, thanks for watching, as you always do. I'll see you next time.